You were not meant to be controlled by this. Not by people, not by opinions, not by silence, not by rejection, not even by success. But there is a pattern you are still trapped inside, and it is costing you everything you think you are trying to build. The moment you start caring too much, you lose direction. The moment you start trying to be understood, you lose power. And the moment you start needing validation, you stop becoming dangerous. That is the part nobody tells you. Because most people are not aware they are being shaped by attention. They live reacting, adjusting, performing, and slowly, without noticing, they become something fragile, easily shaken, easily redirected, easily influenced. But there is a different kind of person. A quieter one, not louder, not more confident, not more expressive, just detached enough to be free. And what you are about to hear is not comfort. It is correction. Because your life right now is being shaped by what you care about too much. Think about it. That message you waited for. That opinion you overanalyzed. That silence you took personally. That opportunity you feared losing. That person you tried to impress. Every single one of those moments pulled your attention outward. And every time your attention leaves you, your control leaves with it. This is the hidden exchange nobody explains. Attention for control, care for dependence, emotion for stability. And the more you give, the less you own yourself. There is a reason Stoic thinkers treated attention like currency. Not because the world is evil, but because the mind is expensive. Every thought you outsource becomes a chain you do not feel tightening. Until one day, you realize you are not deciding your life anymore. You are reacting to it. And here is where the shift begins. Not in effort, not in motivation, but in withdrawal. The controlled removal of unnecessary care. Not about becoming emotionless, but about becoming selective. Because when you care about everything, nothing is in your control. But when you care precisely, you become unmovable. Now listen carefully, because this is where most people misunderstand the entire idea. Letting go does not mean ignoring life. It means refusing to be governed by it. There is a difference between awareness and attachment. Between observation and dependence. Between presence and consumption. And right now, you are consuming too much of everything that should only pass through you. Words, opinions, expectations, outcomes. You are holding on to things that were never designed to be held. And that grip is what is exhausting you. Not life itself. Life is neutral. It is your interpretation that creates weight. So the real question is not how do you care less. It is what should you never have been caring about in the first place. Because once you remove the wrong attachments, something subtle happens. Your mind gets quieter, your decisions get cleaner, your reactions slow down, and people start noticing something they cannot explain. You are no longer easy to read, no longer easy to move, no longer easy to disturb. And that is where power begins. But there is a cost to this realization. Because the moment you stop overcaring, you start seeing people clearly. Not as threats, not as validation sources, not as judges, but as distractions from your own direction. And that clarity can feel isolating at first. Because most relationships are built on mutual dependency, not mutual strength. So when you change, the structure around you shifts. Some people will misunderstand your silence. Some will interpret your distance as arrogance. Some will try to pull you back into emotional noise. And you will feel the pressure to return to who you were. This is the test most people fail. They mistake discomfort for wrongness. But discomfort is often the beginning of independence. There is a reason disciplined minds feel less emotionally available to chaos. It is not because they lost feeling. It is because they stopped feeding unnecessary ones. Now before you continue, there is something you need to do. Not for me, not for this video, for your own awareness. If this idea is starting to make sense, if you recognize even one part of yourself in this pattern, then do not scroll past it. Pause for a moment, and in the comments, write this phrase, I stop reacting. Not as motivation, as declaration, because the act of naming it changes your relationship with it. And if you are watching closely, you already know this is not about agreement. It is about recognition, because what you recognize, you can no longer unconsciously obey. And most people will never say this out loud, but they live trapped inside emotional automation. React, respond, regret, repeat. until their entire identity becomes unstable. But there is a different path forming here. One where attention is no longer scattered. One where reactions are no longer automatic. One where silence becomes a tool, not a weakness. And that is where everything starts to shift. Not externally first, internally. Because when you stop caring about what is irrelevant, you begin noticing what actually matters. Your time stops leaking. Your energy stops fragmenting. Your focus stops breaking. And suddenly, life feels less like survival, and more like direction. But do not mistake this for peace yet. This is only the beginning of withdrawal. And withdrawal always feels like loss before it feels like clarity. There will be moments where you feel disconnected. Moments where you feel like you are losing interest in things you once chased. Moments where silence feels too heavy. That is not failure. That is recalibration. Your mind adjusting to the absence of noise it was addicted to. And if you resist that phase, you will go back to distraction. But if you pass through it, something irreversible begins to form. A kind of internal distance from chaos. Not avoidance, control. And once you experience that, you will begin to understand a simple truth that changes how you move through everything. Most of what you were emotionally invested in was never important enough to control you. But it did anyway, because you allowed attention to be borrowed without limits. And now you are beginning to see the cost. There is more to this shift than you realize. Because what comes next is not just emotional detachment. It is identity reconstruction. And that is where things get deeper. But you are not there yet. Right now, you are only beginning to stop feeding what has been feeding on your focus. And if you continue this path, you will eventually notice something strange. The world does not change. But your experience of it does. And that difference is everything. The world does not change. But your experience of it does. And that is the point where most people misunderstand transformation entirely. They wait for circumstances to improve before they change internally. They wait for respect before they become composed. They wait for clarity before they stop reacting. But control never arrives from outside. It only appears when external noise stops being interpreted as internal instruction. Right now, your mind is still doing something subtle. It is treating everything as a signal meant to influence you. A tone in someone's message becomes a judgment. A delay becomes rejection. A silence becomes meaning. A loss becomes identity damage. And without noticing, you are living inside a constant translation of reality that is not reality itself. It is interpretation layered on top of uncertainty. And that interpretation is what drains you. Stoic thinkers understood something most people still miss. You do not suffer from events. You suffer from your agreement with their importance. Not everything deserves interpretation. Not everything deserves reaction. Not everything deserves space inside your mind. But your current state does not discriminate. It absorbs everything equally. That is why you feel mentally overloaded even on quiet days. Not because life is too much, but because your attention is unfiltered. And an unfiltered mind is always in motion. Always scanning. Always reacting. Always adjusting. Until eventually, it forgets what stillness feels like. Now understand this clearly. Detachment is not distance from life. It is precision in what enters you. Because everything that enters your attention begins to influence your behavior. Even slightly, even silently, even without permission. So if your attention is uncontrolled, your life becomes indirectly controlled. Not by force, but by accumulation. Small emotional reactions stacking over time until they form a personality you did not consciously choose. This is why most people feel like they are not fully steering their own lives. They are not being controlled by one big force. They are being shaped by thousands of small ones. And here is where the shift becomes irreversible. When you start noticing the gap between stimulus and response, that gap is your real power. Not control over events, control over interpretation. And control over interpretation is control over identity formation. Because you are not what happens to you. You are what you consistently decide it means. But there is a deeper layer. Because even awareness of this truth is not enough. You can understand detachment intellectually and still remain emotionally reactive. Which means knowledge alone does not change behavior. Training does. Repetition does. Withdrawal practice does. And this is where most people stop too early. They agree with the idea but continue living unchanged. Still checking. Still reacting. Still explaining themselves. still seeking confirmation from noise. So let this be a dividing point. Not in belief, in execution. If you are still watching this without applying even a small part of it mentally, then nothing changes. But if you begin to observe your reactions in real time, something starts breaking inside the old pattern. So here is a simple internal discipline you can use immediately. When something triggers you, do not respond instantly. Do not explain. Do not justify. Pause long enough to notice the impulse itself. Not the situation, the impulse. Because that impulse is where your conditioning reveals itself. And once you see it, it loses automatic authority. That is the beginning of control. Not suppression, observation. And observation removes unconscious obedience. Now before continuing, there is something important to understand. This shift will make you feel different from people around you. Not superior, not inferior, just less available to emotional escalation. And that difference will create friction. People will try to pull you back into old versions of yourself. Through arguments, through guilt, through familiarity, through emotional expectation. And if you are not aware of this, you will mistake their discomfort for your wrongdoing. You are not becoming distant. You are becoming less manipulable. And most people are not used to that version of you. So they will attempt to restore the older one. The reactive one. The explainable one. The emotionally accessible one. But that version of you is the one that leaked energy everywhere. That is why you are changing it. Now listen carefully, because this is where discipline becomes identity. You do not try to care less. You build a system where unnecessary care becomes structurally impossible. That means fewer inputs, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer mental permissions given to external noise. Your attention becomes selective by default. And selection creates strength. Because where attention goes repeatedly, identity follows. If your attention is scattered, your identity fragments. If your attention is focused, your identity solidifies. That is the hidden mechanism behind every disciplined person you have ever observed. They are not reacting more intelligently. They are reacting less frequently. There is a difference. Now at this point, most people assume this path leads to emotional emptiness. But that assumption comes from misunderstanding attachment. Letting go of unnecessary care does not reduce your emotional capacity. It restores it. Because right now, your emotional system is diluted. Too many reactions. Too many micro-attachments. Too many interpretations competing for space. When everything matters, nothing is felt deeply. But when only what is essential remains, perception sharpens. You begin to feel less noise and more signal. Less reaction and more clarity. And clarity is what feels like power from the inside. But externally, it looks like calm. That is why calm people are often misunderstood. They are not lacking emotion. They are filtering it. And filtering requires strength most people do not develop. Now there is a point in this process where something unexpected happens. You start noticing people differently. Not in a judgmental way. In a structural way. You see patterns. Who reacts impulsively? Who depends on validation? Who speaks to influence rather than express? Who drains attention without awareness? And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This creates a silent separation between perception and participation. You are still present in conversations, but no longer fully consumed by them. This is where inner authority begins forming. And with it, a quiet form of independence. Not from people, from their influence over your internal state. Now there is a risk here. Because with this awareness comes temptation. The temptation to disengage completely. To withdraw emotionally from everything. To reduce interaction to a minimum. But that is not mastery. That is avoidance. And avoidance is still dependence, just inverted. True control is not absence of engagement. It is absence of compulsion. You can engage without being pulled. You can speak without being altered. You can observe without absorbing. That is the level you are moving toward. But only if you continue. Because most people will feel this shift and retreat back into familiarity. The old emotional loops feel safer because they are predictable. Even if they are draining. Even if they are limiting. Predictability often feels like stability. But it is not stability. It is repetition. And repetition without awareness becomes identity imprisonment. So this is the point where a decision is forming. Not externally, internally. Whether you continue reacting to life. Or begin observing it. Because observation is where separation begins. And separation is where control begins. And control is where everything you thought you were missing quietly starts forming. But you are still early in this transition. There is a deeper stage ahead, where even your sense of self begins to be questioned. And that is where real transformation becomes unavoidable. There is a stage of this shift that feels less like improvement and more like erosion. Not destruction in a chaotic sense, but the slow removal of what you assumed was permanent. Your reactions begin to lose intensity. Your emotional spikes become shorter. Your need to explain yourself weakens. And something underneath all of that starts to surface. Not clarity at first, uncertainty. Because when you stop over-caring about external validation, you are left alone with something most people never face directly. Your unfiltered self. No audience, no response loops, no emotional mirrors, just thought, awareness, and silence between them. And that silence is uncomfortable in the beginning. Because for a long time, your identity was shaped in relation to others. Who approves of you? Who ignores you? Who reacts to you? Who remembers you? Who misunderstands you? Without those reflections, you are forced to confront something more fundamental. Who you are when nothing is responding to you. This is where most people unconsciously escape back into noise. Not because noise is better, but because it is familiar. Reaction feels like identity. Stillness feels like disappearance. But what is actually happening is not disappearance. It is subtraction. Layers are being removed that were never truly you. And what remains is not empty. It is unstructured. And unstructured identity feels unstable at first. Because you cannot rely on emotional reactions to define yourself anymore. You are forced into something more deliberate. Observation without attachment. Choice without urgency. Presence without dependency. And this is where internal authority begins forming in a way that cannot be faked. Because it is no longer supported by external reinforcement. There is a moment in this process where you notice something subtle. You do not rush to respond as much anymore. You do not feel the same pressure to explain yourself immediately. You are no longer emotionally chasing closure in conversations. You are no longer trying to fix misunderstandings that do not affect your direction. And strangely, life does not collapse without that urgency. It continues, but with less friction, and more space. That space is what most people are afraid of. Because space removes distraction, and without distraction, awareness turns inward. And when awareness turns inward without resistance, you begin to see patterns that were previously hidden by constant engagement. Patterns in your thoughts, patterns in your emotional triggers, patterns in your assumptions about people, patterns in how quickly you assign meaning to neutral events. And once you see these patterns clearly, you cannot fully return to unconscious living. That is the irreversible point. Not because you become different, but because you become aware of how mechanical much of your previous behavior was. And that realization creates distance from your old identity. Not rejection, distance. You stop believing every thought immediately. You stop treating every emotion as instruction. You stop assuming urgency equals importance. And this changes how you move through the world. Externally, nothing dramatic happens. Internally, everything reorganizes. Your mind starts slowing down its interpretation cycle. Events no longer immediately become stories. They remain events longer. And that delay is where control forms. Because reaction is no longer automatic. It becomes optional. Now there is something important that happens at this stage. You start noticing how often people are governed by emotional urgency. They speak to resolve discomfort, not to express clarity. They argue to restore internal stability, not to seek truth. They react to reduce tension, not to understand reality. And once you see this, your tolerance for unnecessary emotional noise decreases. Not in a judgmental way, in a functional way, because you begin to recognize how expensive emotional reactivity is. It consumes attention, it fragments focus, it distorts decisions, and most people never calculate this cost. They only feel it as exhaustion. But you begin to see the structure behind it. Every reaction is a withdrawal from your own presence. Every unnecessary emotional engagement is a loss of internal alignment. Every attempt to manage other people's perception is a diversion from your own direction. And slowly, your priorities begin to shift. Not toward isolation, toward efficiency of attention. Because attention is no longer something you spend carelessly. It becomes something you guard. And when attention becomes guarded, identity begins to stabilize. You are no longer shaped by what enters you randomly. You are shaped by what you allow consistently. This is where discipline stops being behavior and becomes architecture. You are not forcing yourself to be different. You are restructuring what influences you. And influence is everything. Now there is a point where you will feel tempted to test this shift socially. To see how people respond when you react less. When you explain less. When you care less about immediate validation. And the response will not always be comfortable. Some people will push harder. Some will withdraw. Some will interpret your stillness as emotional distance. And you will feel the pressure to return to your previous version. The more expressive one. The more accessible one. The more reactive one. But that version was not more alive. It was more exposed. There is a difference. Exposure feels like connection until it becomes depletion. And what you are doing now is reducing unnecessary exposure. Not eliminating connection. Removing dependence from connection. Now there is a critical distinction forming here. Detachment is not about not caring. It is about not being controlled by what you care about. Because care without control becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability without structure becomes instability. But care within control becomes precision. And precision is what allows you to move without emotional distortion. At this stage, something else begins to shift quietly. Your sense of time. You stop feeling as pressured by immediate outcomes. You stop rushing internal conclusions. You stop forcing clarity before it naturally forms. And this gives your mind space to process reality without distortion. Most people never experience this because they constantly interrupt their own thinking with reaction. Text messages, opinions, notifications, imagined scenarios, memory loops, future anxiety, all competing for attention at once. And so their internal world never settles long enough to become clear. But when you reduce reaction, time inside your mind expands. Not externally, internally. And expanded internal time allows deeper reasoning, calmer judgment, and more stable identity formation. This is where transformation becomes noticeable not just to you, but eventually to others. Because your responses begin to change. Less urgency, less emotional fluctuation, less need to be understood immediately, and more presence in silence. But you are not finished yet. Because even at this stage, there is still a subtle attachment remaining. The attachment to being someone who is in control. And that attachment, if left unchecked, becomes a new identity trap. Because now you are no longer reacting to external validation. You may start reacting to internal superiority. To the idea of being above emotional noise. To the idea of being detached. And that is the final distortion before true mastery. Because even control can become an identity performance. Real detachment does not announce itself internally. It does not create pride. It does not require recognition. It simply reduces unnecessary engagement until only what is essential remains. And even that is held lightly. Not possessed. Not glorified. Just used when necessary. And released when not. Now the question becomes unavoidable. If you remove all the noise, all the reactions, all the emotional dependency, what exactly remains of you? That question is where the final stage begins. And in the next part, everything tightens further. Because what you think is the self, begins to dissolve even more. And what replaces it is not emptiness. It is something far more precise. But you are not there yet. What remains when you remove the noise is not emptiness. It only feels that way at first because you were trained to recognize yourself through reaction. Through emotional spikes. Through external feedback. Through urgency disguised as importance. So when those layers fade, the mind mislabels the absence as loss. But what is actually happening is refinement. The removal of everything that was never stable enough to define you in the first place. And now there is nowhere left for illusion to hide. No immediate reaction to escape into. No external validation to stabilize your internal state. No emotional urgency to mask uncertainty. Only awareness remaining in its raw form. And this is where a subtle reversal occurs. You stop needing the world to be different in order to be stable. Because stability is no longer being produced externally. It is being maintained internally through non-reaction. And that changes everything. Because most people live inside a continuous negotiation with reality. If this happens, I feel this. If they respond like that, I become this. If I lose this, I collapse into that. Their identity is conditional, always dependent on external behavior. But what you are building now is non-conditional presence. Not numbness, not withdrawal, but independence from emotional conversion. Events no longer automatically transform into identity shifts. They remain external, and that separation is where control becomes permanent. Now something else begins to happen that is harder to notice. You become less interested in explaining yourself. Not because you cannot, but because you no longer feel the need to convert your internal state into external approval. Explanation was once a form of control, a way to manage how you are perceived, a way to stabilize uncertainty through social feedback. But now, silence carries more efficiency than explanation. And this shift will feel strange at first. Because silence used to feel like weakness. Now it feels like neutrality. And neutrality is far more powerful than persuasion. Because persuasion still depends on the other person. Neutrality depends on nothing. It simply exists without adjustment. And this is where your identity begins to stabilize in a way that is not fragile. Because it is no longer built on reaction cycles. It is built on observation. And observation does not collapse under pressure. It simply continues. Now there is a point in this final phase where something subtle becomes obvious. You start to see how much of your past behavior was performative. Not in a dramatic sense, but in small consistent adjustments to be accepted, understood, or approved. Even your personality in certain environments was partially adaptive. You were not one fixed identity. You were a responsive system, shifting depending on emotional context. And there is nothing wrong with adaptability. But uncontrolled adaptability becomes fragmentation. Because every environment begins to extract a different version of you. And none of them remain consistent long enough to become stable identity. So what you are doing now is not becoming less social. It is becoming less fragmented. Fewer versions, fewer emotional masks, fewer automatic responses, and more internal consistency regardless of environment. That consistency is what people recognize as presence, even if they cannot explain it. Now there is a deeper realization forming here. Most emotional suffering was not caused by reality itself. It was caused by resistance to interpretation. The constant need to resolve uncertainty immediately. To label everything. To respond to everything. To stabilize every emotional fluctuation as quickly as possible. But reality does not require immediate resolution. It requires accurate observation. And observation requires delay, space, distance from automatic meaning making. So as this process deepens, your mind begins to slow down its interpretive habit. Not because you force it, but because you stop feeding it unnecessary triggers. And in that slowing, clarity appears. Not dramatic clarity, quiet clarity, the kind that does not need reinforcement. Now at this stage, something very important becomes visible. You no longer fear emotional discomfort in the same way. Not because you are immune to it, but because you stop interpreting it as danger. You recognize it as transition. A temporary adjustment period between old reaction patterns and new stability. And this removes one of the strongest forces that used to control you. Fear of internal discomfort. Because most people are not controlled by external events. They are controlled by their avoidance of how those events make them feel. But when you stop reacting instantly, you begin to tolerate emotional discomfort without collapsing into it. And that tolerance is where independence forms. Now the final distortion begins to dissolve. The need to feel important through reaction. Because attention was never just about awareness. It was about identity reinforcement. Every emotional reaction was a small confirmation of selfhood. I feel this, therefore I am this. But when reactions reduce, identity is no longer constantly reaffirmed. And instead of collapsing, it stabilizes in a quieter form. Not constructed through emotional intensity, but through consistent presence. And at this point, something unexpected becomes clear. You are not losing yourself. You are losing unnecessary versions of yourself. And what remains is not emptiness. It is reduction to essentials. Thought without compulsion, emotion without dependency, awareness without distortion. Now there is only one remaining challenge. Not external, internal. Whether you will continue to identify with control itself. Because even detachment can become identity. Even silence can become performance. Even discipline can become ego structure. And if that happens, the cycle restarts in a more subtle form. So the final stage is not about becoming detached. It is about becoming unbound from even the idea of detachment. No label, No identity fixation. No internal narrative of superiority or separation. Just clean awareness, responding only when necessary. And not responding when it is not. That is the end of unnecessary struggle. Not because life becomes easier, but because you stop adding resistance to it. And in that state, something very simple becomes obvious. Most of what once felt overwhelming was never larger than your attention made it. It only had weight because you gave it continuous internal presence. And when that presence is withdrawn, the weight disappears. Not because the world changed, but because you stopped feeding distortion into it. Now there is nothing left to chase in this idea. Nothing left to prove. Only a quiet return to control over attention. And from that control, everything else reorganizes naturally. Not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. And if you have followed this far, there is only one direction left. Not forward into more complexity, but deeper into simplicity, where nothing unnecessary is allowed to stay inside your mind for long enough to control you again. That is the silent command. Watch your reactions, reduce what does not serve clarity, and do not return to what already proved it could not hold your attention without costs.